The moment an avoidant comes back, you hold all the power they thought you'd never gain. They don't return for no reason. Your distance created a shift they didn't expect. Now they're the ones seeking connection. An avoidant coming back is never random. It's a response to the emotional gap they once believed you would never allow. When you finally stopped overgiving, over-explaining, and overextending, they felt the loss of the emotional access they used to take for granted. It's not your warmth it's the stability, the safety, the understanding you offered without ever asking for anything in return. And when that energy disappears, it forces even the most distant avoidant to confront the truth. You were not chasing them anymore, and that silence became louder than every conversation you once begged to have. This is where your power begins, not in what you say, but in who you have become while they were gone. You didn't just detach from them, you detached from the version of yourself who accepted crumbs in place of connection. Avoidants come back because their internal fear system gets activated, not by your presence, but by your absence. They expected you to remain available forever. They expected that no matter how far they pulled away, you would emotionally hold the line for the both of you. The moment they see that line drop, the panic begins, the silent, internal panic they never show, but always feel. And when they do return, you are no longer required to perform, to explain, to soften yourself to fit their emotional limitations. You are not here to reassure or rebuild the ground they repeatedly shattered. Your only job is to stand in the strength you gained while they were gone. Because the version of you they left behind is not the version they're meeting now. And that difference is why the dynamic flips. They approach with uncertainty. You respond with clarity. They offer breadcrumbs, you offer boundaries. They seek comfort. You protect your peace. This moment isn't about rejecting them out of anger. It's about responding from the calm place you earned through healing. The avoidant returns expecting the same emotional landscape, the empath who absorbed their distance, the heart that forgave, the soul that waited. But what they find instead is someone grounded, self-respecting, and no longer willing to negotiate their worth. You don't react, you observe. You don't chase, you choose. You don't collapse into the old pattern, you stand on the new one. And that's what terrifies them most, not your rejection, but your evolution. Because when you finally step into your power, the dynamic they relied on dissolves. The avoidant who once ran now stands still, facing the consequences of their own emotional avoidance. Can you finally realize that the moment they come back isn't an invitation to reconnect. It's proof of how far you've risen without them. Avoidants expect emotional intensity or validation. Your neutral tone tells them everything. You're no longer the version they could emotionally escape from. When an avoidant returns, they subconsciously anticipate the old pattern, the one where your heart rushed to meet them halfway, where your excitement leaked through every word, where your emotions filled the space their distance created. They expect you to be relieved, eager, grateful even. They expect the familiar emotional cushion that made their detachment feel safe. But when you respond with calm neutrality, the entire script collapses. Your silence becomes the message they never prepared for. Not angry silence, not cold silence, but composed silence. The kind that doesn't punish, but reveals. The kind that shows you're no longer emotionally entangled in their inconsistency. This is the moment they realize the emotional power you once handed to them so freely has returned to its rightful owner. You. And nothing destabilizes an avoidant more than a person they assumed would always be emotionally available, suddenly becoming unbothered. Staying calm doesn't mean pretending. It means you genuinely don't feel the same internal urgency you once did. It means their return doesn't stir the anxiety it used to. It means you're not emotionally activated by their presence, their apology, or their attempt to reconnect. You see it for what it is, a cycle, a pattern, a reflex triggered by your absence. And instead of feeding it with emotion, you acknowledge it with clarity. When you respond without over-explaining, without over-giving, without bending yourself to make them comfortable, the avoidant feels something they rarely experience: accountability. Not the kind you force through confrontation, but the quiet kind that comes from no longer meeting their emotional avoidance with your emotional availability. They can no longer hide behind the excuse of being overwhelmed because your calmness removes all overwhelm. They can no longer claim they pulled away because things were too intense. Because your energy is grounded and balanced, Your neutrality puts the spotlight exactly where it belongs, on their inconsistency, not on your heart. The avoidant becomes hyper aware in this moment. They start noticing your tone, your pauses, your simplicity. They sense the shift, even if they never admit it. This isn't the person who once waited for their messages, reread their words, or tried to decode their silence. This isn't the person they could temporarily detach from and expect to return unchanged. The version of you they're facing now holds emotional self-respect, and that is more disarming to an avoidant than any confrontation could ever be. Calmness is your power because it communicates the one thing an avoidant never expects. You no longer need their validation. And when you're no longer fueled by seeking their approval, they lose the emotional leverage they once used to keep the connection uneven. Your neutrality shifts the entire dynamic, making them realize the distance they created didn't just give them space, it gave you perspective. And once you've reached that level of calm, the avoidant can sense it instantly. You're not impressed by their return. You're simply no longer attached to their chaos. No warmth, no immediate closure. It's just self-respect. Show them that disappearing isn't something you tolerate. When an avoidant returns, they often expect you to meet them with softness, the same softness that made it easy for them to leave in the first place. They assume the door they walked out of is still wide open, untouched, waiting for them like a familiar escape route. They expect that their absence will be overlooked, brushed aside, or forgiven simply because they decided to reappear. But that's exactly where your new version stands firm. Their return is not an event you celebrate. It's a reflection of the consequences they created. Avoidants don't return because they suddenly discovered emotional maturity. They return because the emotional safety net they relied on has been pulled away. Your presence was stable. Your attention was consistent. Your heart was predictable in the most comforting way. And when that disappears, they feel a shift. They don't know how to process, but that shift is not a reward for them. It's a wake-up call. And it's not your responsibility to soothe the discomfort they created. So when they reach out, your job is not to pour warmth into the space their absence carved. Your job is to remain grounded, controlled, clear. Why? Because rewarding an avoidance disappearance trains them to repeat the pattern. Every time you show enthusiasm after their return, you reinforce the belief that distance doesn't cost them anything, that silence won't change your loyalty, that disappearing is a behavior that comes with convenience, not consequence. But when you respond with measured energy, not coldness, not cruelty, just self-respect, something powerful happens. They feel the boundary they never expected you to grow. Your lack of instant praise or emotional reassurance becomes the barrier they didn't see coming. Avoidants thrive on the idea that you will always be emotionally available, whether they are or not. When they discover that access requires consistency, not sporadic reappearances, the dynamic shifts permanently. You are not rejecting them out of spite. You are rejecting the pattern. And an avoidant can sense that instantly. Your tone, your pacing, your lack of urgency. It tells them the emotional landscape is different now. You're not trying to win them back. You're not trying to keep the connection intact. You're not trying to make them feel comfortable after they chose discomfort for you. Instead, you are standing in your worth. And the truth is this: avoidants only learn through boundaries, not through emotional cushioning. By refusing to reward their absence, you teach the one lesson they have avoided their entire life, that closeness has value and distance has a cost. It's not revenge, it's alignment. It's not punishment, it's protection. It's not coldness, it's clarity. And once they feel that clarity, they finally recognize what you've known all along. Access to you is a privilege, not a guarantee. Say something simple like, "What made you reach out now?" This forces them to confront the gap between their distance and their desire. Avoidants are most comfortable when the emotional spotlight is off them, when they can slip in and out without having to explain, define, or take responsibility for the space they create. They thrive in ambiguity because ambiguity protects them from accountability. It allows them to return without addressing why they left, and it gives them the illusion that connection can be paused like a movie and resumed whenever they feel ready. But one grounding question shatters that illusion instantly. Asking what made you reach out now is not aggressive. It's not emotional. It's not confrontational. It's simply clear, and clarity is the one thing avoidants struggle to handle because it requires them to acknowledge their own emotional patterns, the inconsistency they hide, the avoidance they justify, the pullback they treat as normal. This single question forces them into a moment of self-reflection they've spent years avoiding. It's a gentle invitation into honesty, but it's also a mirror they did not expect you to hold up. Avoidants return hoping to bypass the emotional reality of the situation. They hope the connection can resume without addressing the break. They expect you to be so relieved by their presence that you never question their absence. So when you ask this grounding question, you interrupt the emotional autopilot they rely on. Suddenly, they are the one being asked to explain, not you. They are the one standing in uncertainty. They are the one navigating emotional vulnerability, even if only for a moment. And what makes this question powerful is its simplicity. You're not accusing them, you're not demanding answers, you're not expressing hurt. You're creating emotional accountability without emotional intensity. They can't hide behind excuses like "I've been busy" or "I needed space," because those responses sound hollow when placed next to your calm clarity. Your question highlights the contradiction between their behavior and their return. If they needed distance, why reach out now? If they weren't ready for closeness, then what changed? If they disappeared, why expect you to simply accept their presence now? The avoidant feels this shift deeply. Your tone remains grounded, but the emotional dynamic flips. For the first time, they're required to step into emotional responsibility instead of escaping it. In the most powerful part, you're not asking the question to fix the relationship. You're asking it to understand their intention. There is no chasing in this question, no fear, no longing, just discernment. This moment becomes a test, not for you, but for them. Can they handle clarity? Can they acknowledge their inconsistency? Can they meet your calm truth without retreating into their patterns? And whether they answer honestly, vaguely, defensively, or not at all, the question itself reveals everything you need to know. Are they returning to reconnect or simply to reaccess what they lost? Avoidants rely on your empathy. When you stay guarded, they feel the emotional boundary for the first time. For so long, your heart was the open door, the place where they could walk in and out without fear of emotional consequence. You were the safety net, the emotional grounding, the consistent presence they assumed would never disappear. And that is exactly why closing the emotional door now is so powerful, not slammed shut, not locked aggressively, simply closed, calm, intentional, and grounded in self-respect. Keeping the door closed doesn't mean being cold or cruel. It means understanding that empathy without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. It means refusing to reopen emotional space to someone who treated it like a convenience. Avoidance moves through relationships with the belief that your compassion will always forgive them, your softness will always welcome them, and your love will always smooth over the damage their distance caused. But when you finally protect your emotional space, they meet a version of you they never expected, a version that chooses healing over history. Your guardedness is not about punishing them. It's about honoring yourself. You're not withholding affection to manipulate the situation. You're not creating distance to gain power. You're simply not offering the emotional availability you once gave without question. And this shift is something the avoidant feels immediately. They can sense the change in your tone, your timing, your approach. You're no longer emotionally open by default. You're intentional now, selective, measured. Avoidants fear emotional responsibility, but they also fear emotional loss. When you stop giving them free access to your heart, it triggers a deep internal conflict. The desire for closeness meets the fear of vulnerability. Your closed emotional door forces them to confront this tension directly. It shows them what true boundaries feel like, not the kind that comes with anger, but the kind that comes with self-worth. And that's the boundary they can't run from. By keeping the emotional door closed, you communicate something they never expected to hear. The return does not guarantee your openness. You're not impressed by the timing. You're not moved by their reappearance. You're not bending to accommodate their sudden emotional curiosity. You've learned that access to your inner world requires consistency, not disappearance. And that is something they must prove, not something you simply hand over again. This emotional closure is the exact moment they realize the true cost of their avoidance. They're not losing the relationship, they're losing the version of you who tolerated the emotional imbalance, the version who overextended, the version who loved them past their fear. And once you protect your growth, something shifts permanently. You stop being emotionally available to someone who only valued you once. You walked away. Your guardedness becomes your strength, and your strength becomes the lesson they were never ready to face. Use short, composed responses. No over explaining, no chasing, no emotional labor. They feel the contrast instantly because when an avoidant returns, they subconsciously expect you to fall back into old emotional roles. The one who soothed their distance, explained their silence, and carried both sides of the relationship just to keep the connection alive. They're accustomed to you doing the emotional heavy lifting, interpreting their mixed signals, and providing reassurance even when they contributed nothing. But when you shift into a place of reflection instead of validation, everything they relied on collapses. Avoidance feels safest when you fill in the blanks for them. When you assume their intentions, soften their inconsistency, and cushion their emotional discomfort. But the moment you stop doing that, the moment you let their behavior speak for itself, they feel exposed, not judged, not attacked, just seen. And being seen is the very thing they've spent their whole life avoiding. This is why reflecting their energy is so powerful. It turns their own patterns into the mirror they can't escape. Your short, composed responses communicate something they never anticipated. Emotional neutrality. You're not trying to win them back. You're not desperately holding on to the connection. You're not melting at their return. You're simply responding with the same level of investment they offer, and this terrifies them more than any confrontation ever could. Avoidants are prepared to run from intensity, but they are never prepared for indifference. Your calmness takes away their hiding spot. Your simplicity removes their excuses. Your emotional restraint forces them to face the reality of how little they contributed. Reflecting their energy doesn't mean being cold or robotic. It means matching their pace instead of sprinting ahead emotionally. If they take hours to reply, you don't respond instantly. If they give vague messages, you don't overinterpret. If they offer minimal effort, you don't compensate with emotional depth. You hold your energy steady. You mirror, not mend. And in that reflection, they confront themselves. Avoidants aren't used to someone who doesn't chase clarity or reassurance. They're used to escape routes, not accountability. But your calm, balanced responses gently guide them into a place where they must either step up or step away, and either outcome protects your peace. Because validating nothing doesn't punish them. It simply stops rewarding the behavior that once drained you. You're creating an emotional environment they've never experienced with you before. One where their inconsistency no longer gets a reaction and their return no longer gets rewarded. They feel this shift instantly. The lack of emotional cushioning, the absence of urgency, the neutrality that used to be unimaginable coming from you. And in this space, they discover the truth. Your heart is no longer chasing. Your emotions are no longer overflowing. Your energy is no longer rescuing theirs. You're not withholding validation. You're simply no longer offering it for free. And that is the moment the avoidant finally senses what they feared most. They are no longer the emotional center of your world. Say something like, I'm not interested in revisiting this connection. I've moved forward. Simple, direct, clean. Boundaries are not about punishment. They are about clarity. And clarity is the one thing avoidants never expect from you because they're used to you softening your truth in order to preserve the connection. They remember the version of you who toned down your needs, who swallowed your disappointments, who tried to protect the relationship even when they did nothing to protect you. They expect hesitation. They expect emotional wavering. They expect you to bend, to negotiate, to leave the door slightly open, just in case they want to wander back in again. But when you deliver a boundary calmly with no emotional charge, you introduce a version of yourself they never prepared for. A boundary spoken without anger is a boundary rooted in growth. You're not raising your voice. You're raising your standards. You're not rejecting them. You're choosing yourself. And avoidants feel that difference. They hear it in the tone of your voice, the steadiness of your message, the simplicity of your words. You're not asking for anything. You're not waiting for anything. You're not bargaining for closure or clarity. You are simply declaring the reality you now stand in. And that is what makes the boundary so powerful. Avoidants often rely on your emotional flexibility. They depend on the idea that you'll compromise your needs in exchange for their presence. They expect you to soften your truth to protect their comfort. But a clean, clear, grounded boundary is the ultimate disruption to that dynamic. It leaves no room for misinterpretation, no emotional wiggle room, no cracks to slip through. It forces them to face the fact that the relationship they treated casually is something you are now releasing intentionally. When you say, I've moved forward, you aren't trying to convince them. You are simply stating a fact you discovered through healing, not through hurt. And the avoidant feels the weight of that truth because it's not reactive, it's resolved. There's no emotional spike for them to hide behind, no argument to deflect, no intensity to blame, just your quiet certainty and their internal awareness that they created this outcome. Boundaries delivered with calm energy create the emotional accountability they've always avoided. They can't run from it. They can't minimize it. They can't reinterpret it to protect themselves. Your calmness forces them to confront the reality that their absence wasn't neutral. It had consequences. Their silence wasn't invisible. It left an imprint. Their distancing didn't keep them safe. It kept them alone. And when you stand firmly in your boundary, something shifts inside you too. You realize you're no longer trying to hold on to someone who couldn't hold on to you. You're no longer fighting for a connection built on imbalance. You're no longer shrinking yourself to make room for their fear. A clear boundary isn't the end of your strength. It's the proof you finally learned how to honor it. And that's why it hits harder than anger ever could. In the conversation, don't linger. Don't reopen the door. Leaving first removes the last piece of their emotional leverage because for as long as the conversation continues, an avoidant can still feel a sense of control, a belief that they have access to your attention, your emotional energy, your presence. Avoidance feels safe when they know you're still engaged, still responding, still affected. Even if the conversation is neutral, your continued participation allows them to maintain a quiet thread of connection without offering any real intimacy. But when you walk away first, that thread snaps, and it's the one outcome their emotional system never prepared for. Avoidants operate through distance. They're wired to feel safe by controlling how close or far things are. When they return, they expect to dictate the pace, slow, hesitant, on their terms. They come back assuming they still hold the emotional authority they once had, that you'll wait for them to decide how deep or shallow the interaction goes. Walking away first flips that dynamic instantly. It tells them you don't control the access anymore, I do. Leaving the conversation calmly is not abandonment, it's closure on your terms. You're not storming out, you're not punishing them, you're not creating drama. You're simply choosing to end the interaction with the same clarity you carried throughout. And avoidants feel this more deeply than any long emotional explanation. They may not show it, but they feel the shift, the loss of you as their emotional safety net, the loss of your attention, the loss of the subtle reassurance that you once always provided. When you say your boundary and then walk away, you deliver the message without overstating it. You give them nothing to argue with, nothing to push against, nothing to misinterpret. Avoidants are experts at staying in gray spaces, at keeping conversations half open, at lingering in connections without committing to them. But your decision to end the moment removes the gray. It brings the dynamic into sharp clarity. The access they once took for granted no longer exists. Not partially, not conditionally, completely. This is where your growth becomes undeniable because walking away first used to feel impossible. You once held on to every word, every moment, every slight hope that maybe things would be different. You used to wait for them to end the conversation, terrified that stepping away first meant losing them entirely. But now you understand something much deeper. Losing someone who cannot meet you emotionally is not loss, it's liberation. Walking away first is not about proving a point. It's about protecting your peace. It's about breaking the pattern that kept you emotionally stuck. It's about reclaiming the power you gave away, piece by piece, while trying to love someone who didn't know how to stay. And the moment you end the conversation calmly, confidently, without hesitation, the avoidant feels the truth. They didn't just lose access to you, they lost access to the version of you who tolerated emotional imbalance. And that is a rejection far louder than any no could ever be. Silence is the one thing they never expect from you. Because for so long, you were the one filling the gaps, the one explaining, clarifying, reaching, repairing. You were the emotional bridge, the stabilizer, the one who held the connection together while they hid behind distance and detachment. But when you choose silence, something shifts, not loudly, not angrily, not dramatically. It shifts in the exact same quiet they used on you, except this time it isn't avoidance, it's closure. Your silence is not a punishment, it's a boundary. It's a declaration that you are done engaging with inconsistency. It's the moment you stop giving them an audience for their emotional unavailability. Avoidants often underestimate silence because they used it as their shield. They assumed you would always react, respond, chase, or fill the void. They counted on your emotional openness to bridge their emotional absence. But when the roles reverse and you choose stillness instead of explanation, something inside them wakes up. Because silence, real silence, does what words can never do. It removes access. Not access to your voice, not access to your explanations, but access to your emotional presence, the very thing that made them feel safe, even when they pretended it didn't. Your quiet, confident refusal becomes the truth they can't escape. They finally see that you're not angry. You're not hurt. You're not waiting for clarity, closure, or apology. You're simply done. And that's the moment the voidant realizes what they truly lost. They didn't lose you because you slammed a door. They didn't lose you because you lashed out. They didn't lose you because of conflict. They lost you because the version of you who tolerated uncertainty, who carried the emotional weight, who stayed steady through their distance, no longer exists. Silence isn't revenge, it's evolution. It's what happens when someone outgrows the emotional chaos they once accepted. Avoidance can ignore words. They can dismiss emotion. They can dodge conversations, but they cannot outrun the impact of your silence. Because silence forces them to sit with themselves, with their patterns, with the truth they avoided for so long. When you refuse to engage, you close the last loophole they relied on. You end the cycle without confrontation. You walk away without permission. You reclaim your energy without negotiation. And in that moment, the avoidant finally understands you didn't walk away out of anger. You walked away out of clarity. And nothing speaks louder than that. Rejection hits differently when it comes from someone who used to hold space for them. Avoidants are used to distance. They're used to silence. They're used to people giving up out of exhaustion or frustration. But what they never expect is growth, because when you reject an avoidant from a place of clarity, not anger, not spite, not desperation, it creates an impact they cannot ignore. It's the shift they never saw coming, when the person who once poured into them no longer needs them, misses them, or waits for them. You're not rejecting them to hurt them. You're rejecting them because you became someone who no longer fits inside the old dynamic. And that difference, that emotional evolution, is what shakes them to their core. At first, they feel confusion. Avoidants often assume you will always be emotionally available, always understanding, always forgiving. They counted on the version of you who absorbed their inconsistency with patience and empathy, the version of you who believed that love meant waiting, the version of you who tried to break through their walls instead of walking away from them. But that version of you is gone. Now you respond differently. Your energy is still. Your tone is neutral. Your boundaries are intact. You no longer chase, negotiate, or explain. You reject them with calm, and that calm is what cuts deepest, because it tells them everything they refused to see when they still had access to you. It tells them you're no longer emotionally affected. It tells them you've stepped into self-worth. It tells them you're capable of choosing peace over potential. Avoidants don't feel the impact of losing someone until the emotional atmosphere changes. It isn't your absence that gets their attention, it's your evolution. It's the moment they can't access the old version of you, that the version who cared too deeply, the version who tried too hard, the version who loved them through their fear. Your growth becomes the mirror they can't turn away from. And suddenly their detachment doesn't feel protective anymore, it feels costly. It feels like the very thing that pushed away the one person who genuinely saw them, rejection from the evolved you, isn't loud. It's not emotional. It's not dramatic. It's simply a closed door with no resentment behind it. And that is what makes it irreversible. Because once you evolve past the wound that attached you to them, you don't go backward. You don't shrink to fit their comfort zone again. You don't dim your emotional intelligence to match their avoidance.
You rise and they feel the distance not as abandonment, but as consequence.
In the end, rejecting an avoidant the right way isn't about proving a point. It's about proving to yourself that you've finally outgrown the version of you who accepted less than they deserved. That's evolution. And that's the chapter they never expected you to reach without them.